Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the Racing News 365 podcast, looking back at last weekend's Las Vegas Grand Prix, but also looking ahead to the penultimate race of the season this weekend in Qatar. From Racing News 365, my name is Nick Golding, and I'm delighted to be joined, as always, by 2023 Young Journalist of the Year, Sam Absolutely Coop. And I'm going to give him a new intro because it's normally the man, the myth, the legend, which I've kind of just said. But instead, I'm going to introduce him as, I think, one of the most dedicated people in this industry. And I'll explain why in a second. It is, of course, lead editor Ian Parks, who, once again, for those watching on YouTube, has the sphere in the background. And the reason I gave Ian that very illustrious intro is because for those who've been watching our F1 updates throughout the season, when Ian has been on site and when he's been able to, every single video has always had a different background. I think none have been better, perhaps, than the sphere. And if you were to watch any other F1 YouTube channel in the paddock or any broadcaster, typically it's the same background, which isn't very fun, whereas Ian goes above and beyond. And on the topic of saying thank you to people, I need to give a quick thank you to two colleagues of ours at Racing News 365, Joris and Fergal, who stood in for Ian and I in last week's podcast. We are back, though. Sam, I'm going to come to you first because you looked after them two very, very well and kept them under control, kept them calm, at least for most of it, it seemed. Las Vegas. So many stories. Mercedes, a shock 1-2. McLaren coming under increasing pressure from Ferrari in the Constructors' Championship. The battle for sixth is intensifying massively. But of course, the big story, Max Verstappen is a four-time world champion. On that note, what was your biggest takeaway from Sin City?
Well, that just says everything, doesn't it, in terms of how much action we had this weekend. And just, I mean, looking at Ian's background, it's so odd seeing Vegas in the day.
He is still in Vegas.
I've been to Vegas before, and even having been there, it's still weird seeing it in daylight. But I mean, the fact that you haven't even mentioned the Cadillac entry as one of those talking points just shows how action-packed that weekend has been. It's been brilliant.
I completely forgot.
I mean, that's the thing. There's just so much to cover.
Yeah.
For me, one of the biggest takeaways of the weekend was actually what I think is a really interesting story. It's a little bit niche, but the whole kind of Red Bull gives Perez and Verstappen wrong wings story, which I mean is a perfect example of how a little rumor can kind of get sown somewhere. Someone can say something to someone and it just gets blown into this massive thing. Completely incorrect. This story that first came out about, they packed the wrong one, as if any F1 team would ever make a kind of mistake of that magnitude. So for me, the biggest takeaway was that actually just how quickly things can spread and grow in a paddock. And also that the Cadillac news is an example of that as well. Just how all of a sudden F1 it's just turned this seemingly never going to have an 11th F1 team in the under the current or next Concord agreement to all of a sudden being like, actually no, it's they're able to prove that this will be worth it for the sport and the rest of the teams. But yeah, going back to the wing story, what actually is the case is that Red Bull don't have a specialist low downforce wing, and even a team of Red Bull size has to make these really brutal decisions in the cost cap era. And Max Verstappen really interestingly said that at the moment we're essentially throwing away 2 race weekends a year in Monza and Vegas. And the idea that, a team of Red Bull size has to make those decisions, I think it says a lot about the current state of F1 in a positive way. And also will lead into 2025, which is where our attention is going to start to turn, and see how those teams have to then kind of address this very much on a level playing field between the 4 main teams.
Really interesting takeaway, actually. It reminds me I need to add the Cadillac story to this podcast because actually I completely forgot that with all the chaos. Ian, I'll come to you because you've been right in the middle of the Las Vegas chaos, the lights, the noise, the music, the Red Bull celebrations, the Mercedes celebrations. You've seen it all over the Las Vegas Grand Prix weekend. It is now daytime in Vegas, which, as Sam pointed out, looks really, really odd. But for you, before you fly back to Blighty, what was your biggest takeaway?
I am hoping I'm going to be flying back to Blighty because, as I mentioned to you guys before we came on and started doing this podcast, that even though my flight does not go for another 6 hours, I've already had an email come through saying that it's delayed by 65 minutes for operational reasons. So I really do hope that I am going to be getting a flight out of Las Vegas today, and I will be flying on to Qatar. I am due to be at home for all of 36 hours, but before I go on to Qatar, so it's exactly. Thank you, Sam. Appreciate that. That's a little bit of a low blow, you know. It's
sorry,
uncalled for.
When you're, low blow when you're away from home for the family for near enough 3 weeks, and you're going to be telling me that I lose an hour. Thanks, appreciate it. Moving swiftly on, man. He is. That's
rude. Out of awkwardness for now, I feel bad.
Ian and I have 1 week away, and all chaos has just unfolded. How dare you, Sam? Honestly,
thinks he's Billy. He takes charge. He thinks he's Billy big time already, doesn't he?
Here we go.
We're back.
I think. Yeah. Okay. So amidst what you've just said, amidst all the chaos and the noise, and just as you were leading up into that question, there's sirens blaring outside, and that's just part of being in this place. So the main takeaway for me, looking back on the weekend, basically, is just how open 2025 I think is going to be. Looking at this season, we've had these fluctuations, these swings in form across all the teams. We've been lauding McLaren at one point and how it's taken the lead off Red Bull in the Constructors' Championship. We've then watched Ferrari over the course of the last triple header eat away at that McLaren lead and how strong they were looking coming into this closing triple header. And all of a sudden, you come into this Grand Prix in Las Vegas and McLaren has been off the boil. We thought Ferrari, given their perceived race pace, was going to really run away with it for all intents and purposes in the Grand Prix, lining up second and fourth on the grid. And as I say, we thought their race pace would really kick in and they would get ahead during the course of the Grand Prix. And that never materialized. And instead, it was Mercedes that came back to the fore. So it's almost like, wow, where did that come from, Mercedes? So at this stage, we are going to be going into 2025, and I know we've still got these 2 races to go, of course, really not knowing which team, which driver is going to have the upper hand at any particular time. And what's really made me think about this line in particular is something from Lando Norris in the driver's pen post-race. And he was going on about how worried he was about McLaren's drop-off in form all of a sudden. Across the last triple header, it was various different reasons, but this one in particular in Las Vegas was just a complete lack of qualifying pace, a complete lack of race pace. Yes, the conditions are very different. Cold temperatures, low grip service, but it's something that he feels already that the team has to get a handle on for next year. And then you listen to Charles and Carlos as well, and they're concerned that where did their race pace go when they were hoping to be a lot better? So already 2025 could be an all-time classic, depending on which team or teams are able to get a grip on trying to get everything correct going into next season, or are we just going to see these constant fluctuations in form, circuit dependent, conditions dependent? It's already shaping up for me, and I know we've still got 2 Grand Prix left, but 2025 is already shaping up for me to be, and as I say, it could be an all-time classic season in Formula One.
That's 2 brilliant takeaways from the pair of you. I don't know what's going on today. That's some absolute magic. And the thing that's really interesting in that on your takeaway is the fact that it shows that when this season is done after Abu Dhabi, then looking ahead to 2025, we are going to have so much to talk about over the winter. But next season looks incredible. Just for me, quickly, my biggest takeaway, with the exception of the obvious of Max Verstappen simply getting the job done, becoming a 4-time world champion, joining a very illustrious group of drivers. Looking a bit more in depth, my biggest takeaway is simply the fact that Mercedes claimed a 1-2 and seemingly didn't really understand why or how, which I think is just absolutely fascinating and kind of sums up the season in a way a little bit. But let's get right
said the same, Nick.
Well, yeah,
in the post-race press conference, he said exactly the same. We don't know why.
And of course, we will discuss Mercedes later on, but there are more important things to start off with. And of course, it would be rude not to start with the new 4-time world champion, Max Verstappen. Sam, I'll come to you first on this because Ian and I discussed this a little bit after the race on Saturday night. And, quite simply, Max had a really difficult start to the weekend. Red Bull in general, obviously in free practice 1 and 2, made the changes to the rear wing, which made it have a remarkable shape. But he simply knew the task at hand. He got the job done. There was no, getting the elbows out. It was clean. It was fair. And ultimately, in the end, gets the job done and is a 4-time world champion. I mean, it was, in many ways, similar to Brazil with very different reasons, a champion's drive.
It really was, in the sense that he outperformed the expectations of the car.
Again.
And it's this Senna-esque quality of, I'm going to take something that any other driver wouldn't be able to do, and I'm going to get something from it. There's a really good argument that no other driver on that grid would be able to match the results Max can in that Red Bull. Put Lewis, Fernando, whoever in that car, they still wouldn't be able to extract that extra, 100th or 10th of a second that Max is able to, and that is the difference over the course of the year. And so, you're absolutely right. It's a champion's drive in a very, very different way. It was measured, mature. I just need to do what I need to do. You could hear it on the radio in the race. Him and GP talking, he had the 2 Ferraris coming, behind him. You don't need to fight them. Lando's 16 seconds behind you. All you need to do is finish ahead of him in the road. You've got 10 laps left. You're all good. And he didn't. A younger Max or a less experienced driver in a championship, showdown would make the mistakes that Max and fall into the pitfalls that Max has avoided over the last half a season. So that's why I think it's not just we're seeing Max mature, and yes, we do still see the bits where maybe he hasn't as matured because we're told he's matured, and then Mexico City, things like that happen, but you can't escape the fact that he obviously has progressed and come a very long way as a driver when you contrast this year, even against, the last couple of years when he's been really dominant. He has had to learn so much this season about being a champion in adverse conditions. And so, it's, I think, going to be a seminal chapter in his career when all is said and done. It'll be up there with 2021 in that sense.
And that's a really good point, because actually for me, in my eyes, when you look at this season and Max claiming the title, you look at the start of the year where Red Bull had quite clearly the dominant package and he was extracting everything from it, winning races with relative ease, similar to what he did last season in unbelievable fashion. You then went into the phase of the season, as Ian mentioned a little bit in his takeaway, where Red Bull weren't the best team, and arguably they still aren't. Yet you look at the difficulty Sergio Perez has been having. Max Verstappen, despite not having the strongest car, has still been extracting above and beyond from it, to the point where he's been outperforming stronger teams. And then you look, yes, okay, Mexico City, we've seen him use the dark arts, I like to call it sometimes, but actually, yes, he got a incredible amount of criticism for that. What he then did to respond in Sao Paulo, and for me, that is the key standout, was, it showed that for me was the sign of a mature driver, and that he almost recognised what he did in Mexico City personally probably wasn't correct, but then he rectified it by doing what he did in Sao Paulo in those conditions. And he's almost mastered the car when it's been good, when it's been bad. And ultimately, he's still got, yet again, a huge margin in the championship, which is why he's won this with still 2 races and a sprint to go. But the thing that's really interesting, Ian, is I feel like a little bit, there's almost this perception that Max isn't liked by some drivers because of some of the battles there's been over the years. But it seemed that in Las Vegas on Saturday night, that almost the entire paddock could not praise him any higher.
Pretty much to a man, everybody was singing Max's praises, recognizing the fact that at the end of the day, whilst he might dabble in the dark arts, as you've described it, in fairness, what multiple world champion hasn't done that to a certain extent.
Good point.
To get to the position that they are in. You don't become a world champion just by being Mr. Nice, or a multiple world champion just by being Mr. Nice Guy. You've got to have that degree of ruthlessness on the track. You look at someone even like Alain Prost, nicknamed the Professor for his ingenuity behind the wheel and his craft, his thinking. Even he dabbled on occasion. You've got to have, as I say, that degree of ruthlessness to get to the very top. It's the same with any sport in many respects. It's about pushing yourself and, within Formula One, the regulations to the absolute limit. And Max tested those on occasions, as we saw in Mexico City, as we've discussed, at a great length, and as he came under fire for by numerous critics out there. I think for me, with Max, looking back on this season, what stood out for me, and the word has obviously been used many times, is maturity. But it was that point in the season where Max knew he no longer had the best car. He won 4 of the first 5 races, was dominant. Obviously, the blip was Australia when he had a rare retirement. And he still then won another 3 of the following 5, but they weren't totally dominant. And from that point on, it was a case of simply extracting the best out of himself and out of the car that he had. Now, where I'm going with this is that I think for many drivers, once they've started to lose that degree of momentum, that impetus, they then start trying to fight for results, to push, to go beyond then the limits of within themselves and within the car. And then they start to make mistakes. Max never did that. And that's that key area. I think that's more than the start of the season where he had those wins. That middle point of the season up to that brilliant drive in Brazil is where he really won the title, because Mexico City aside and what happened there, he didn't put a wheel wrong. He didn't make a single mistake. He drove with what he had, as I say, within himself and within the car, ensuring that he got the maximum out of any single given Grand Prix. And it was those points that were accumulated across that particular window that have helped him become this 4-time world champion in my book.
And also, but with Mexico City, yes, he put a foot wrong. I completely agree. But if he hadn't have done that, Lando could have gone on to win that race, and the points deficit, he would have been more adversely affected than he was by being as aggressive as he was in Mexico and incurring that penalty. And I think there's going to be a lot of conversations and debriefs dissecting the season where it was won and lost, and that will inevitably happen in the coming weeks.
Well, we're doing the same.
Lot of people, well, exactly. We will do that, no doubt. But a lot of people are kind of saying that, it was won and lost in the first 4 or 5 rounds. Yeah, to a certain extent. Other people were saying it's won and lost, since Miami. And realistically, there's no zero-sum game here. It's both. From the Miami Grand Prix to now, Max has grown his championship lead over Lando Norris by 10 points, from 53 to 63, which just shows that it isn't solely about the first 4 races. That it kind of disproves that idea that, he wouldn't have won the championship without the dominant car at the start of the year. He actually probably would have been, there or thereabouts, able to fight with Lando. It would have gone much, much more down to the wire, no doubt. And he maybe even would have lost the championship, but he still would have been in the fight. And I think that holds him in really good stead for next season, when there's a very good chance that he is going to be battling in the same way throughout the year. And the point that I kind of made at the top of the podcast, where he's learned so much about how to win across a year in these conditions on aggregate, in that kind of Prost-like way, as you say, Ian. Not just the use of the dark arts when he needs to, but this kind of very clever, let's pick up the points when I need to, and that is ultimately, I think, what the for me the biggest take home of his championship, I guess, is.
So on that point then, I'll put both of you on the spot, but I'll go first to give you a few minutes to think. What do you think of Max's 4 titles? We asked our audience this following the post-race F1 update, and I'll ask our podcast audience again to let us know in the comment section below if you're watching on YouTube. Of Max's 4 titles, which is his greatest? For me, 2023. I think to have a dominant car like the RB19 is one thing, but it takes an exceptional talent to be extracting the most from it on such a consistent basis. So for me, it's still, I think this season has been remarkable from Max, given what he has faced both on and off the circuit in the Red Bull camp. But I think for me, it's still 2023 is his best season in my eyes. Who wants to go first? Go on.
Go on, Sam. You go first, because I touched on this in the update post Grand Prix. So,
okay, I'm going to be a little bit clever with my answer and say that I think his best was this season. However, I think his greatest was 2021.
Explain.
Think because there are quite marked differences between the 2 years. Lando Norris has come a long way this year, but he is no prime Lewis Hamilton. At least, at this stage of his career, there's, I don't think it's unfair to say that there's a very, very good chance he will never be on that level. I think for Max to go up against Lewis in essentially equal machinery across that season and take the fight to him and learn how to be in a championship fight for the first time on the fly against Mercedes and Lewis at near the peak of their powers, I think was a tougher, more titanic task than he has had this season. I think in some ways this year will be more satisfying for him, but I think 2021 for me, I don't know if it's maybe early nostalgia of it, 3 years on, but I look back at that and I just think they both drew something from somewhere, this reserve that I just don't think you really could have anticipated either of them had. And yet they were able to deliver on this kind of this higher plane. And for me, that's why I would say 2021 is that kind of greatest year. So I've slightly warped your question.
Interesting. That's interesting.
I think there's definitely degrees to it.
Okay, so Ian, do you differ?
It's a tough one, isn't it? And you and I did touch on this in the F1 update post Grand Prix, as mentioned. And each one of his titles has merit for very different reasons. The only one I will probably take out of the equation is 2022, because if you look at the 4 and the way each one was won, then that one for me, of course he did well. He faced a deficit to Charles Leclerc, but Ferrari threw that one away more than Max really won it, in my book, if you know what I mean. 2023, for your exact same reasons that you've mentioned, just dominant. But you still got to extract the performance out of the car, and you've only got to look at his teammate and where his teammate finished. Max pretty much, he did. He won the Constructors title on his own. So Checo Perez's points, although he was second in the Drivers' Championship, you could have taken those out of the equation. And as I say, Max on his own would have won the Constructors' Championship for Red Bull. This season started off strong and has really had to fight tooth and nail to get across the finishing line, as I discussed earlier. And then 2021, just a battle for the ages. And you can kind of wear rose-tinted spectacles over that season, just simply as for the way it finished with, that denouement in Abu Dhabi, that controversial ending that, many people still hold against him. Not me, this is not me, but there are people out there who still say that Lewis should be and is an 8-time world champion. That's not me saying that, folks. That's what certain fans and critics out there have mentioned in the past. I think as his greatest season, I think 2023 for me, simply because, yes, he had the most dominant car, but as you've rightly pointed out, Nick, he still had to get the performance out of it day in, day out, weekend in, weekend out. And to produce the level of results that he did with that level of consistency, never making a single mistake, the car never breaking down once across any session, is just phenomenal driving number 1 from Max and phenomenal engineering number 2 from Red Bull.
I think that's enough on Max, the 4-time world champion, and Red Bull, because as I mentioned,
got a trivia question for you. I'll give you that now. You may know it, but if you don't, then I'll leave the answer to the end. So, Michael Schumacher, Lewis Hamilton, Juan Manuel Fangio, get the name right, Sebastian Vettel, Alain Prost, Max Verstappen, or multiple 4-time plus world champions, which is the odd one out.
I know this because I think I've probably put this in about 3 pieces over the course of the weekend. So I'm going to let you. I'll let you answer this first, Nick.
Which is the odd one out?
Yeah. So they've all won 4+ titles.
They've all won
4+, but Fangio's the Fangio's the only one on 5.
No, well, you could argue that one, but I think Sam knows where I am. Should we leave it to the very end, Sam, so people can have a think about it?
Is this the number of days from winning the first title to the 4th?
No. Interesting. So that
unless with Sebastian Vettel.
That is a really fun fact, though, isn't it?
That is a very good fun fact.
You can leave it to the end because I need time to think.
1,079 days between Vettel's first and his 4th, and 1,078 days between Max's first and his 4th. I actually when we get to the answer, I also have a fun fact on the answer, which I actually mentioned to you at 5 o'clock this morning, Ian, if you remember. I think it was one of the first things. It was one of the first things I said to you.
We'll save it for the end because I need some more time to think, because this has been a long weekend. And anyways, McLaren, because
there is a very distinct reason. I was just going to say there is a very distinct reason why this particular driver is the odd one out of those 6.
Interesting. Okay, I've got some time to think. McLaren, one team who also have a lot of thinking to do after Las Vegas. And, well, they were definitely not at the races in Sin City. A massive blow for Lando and Oscar, with Ferrari having taken significant points out of McLaren's lead in the constructors' standings. Going into Qatar, McLaren sit just 24 points ahead of Ferrari, and actually in a very, very interesting position, because Ferrari could overtake McLaren in the constructors' standings coming out of Qatar, but at the same time, McLaren can also wrap up the constructors' title in Qatar as well. So very, very interesting dynamic, and the pressure, obviously, for 2 reasons: the fact that they can win it, but they can also fall down to second in the space of 1 weekend. And I'll come to you first, because we didn't really discuss a lot of McLaren, but Vegas was a massive problem for them. But looking at Qatar, a lot of teams have been saying we expect McLaren to be strong there. And even McLaren themselves have been saying, okay, yeah, Vegas, we weren't too sure, but it's Qatar where we're expecting to be strong. It feels like now, actually, there's almost quite a lot of pressure on McLaren to ensure that Qatar is a good race for them.
Yeah, for many reasons. And I think I mentioned over the course of one of the updates that if you look back at the past triple header, Ferrari took 39 points out of McLaren's lead. Going into this triple header, McLaren had a 36-point lead. And if Ferrari replicated the last triple header in this triple header, they would wrap up the title in Abu Dhabi and be constructors champions for the first time since 2008. And we've come out of this first race of this final triple header, and Ferrari has taken another 12 points out of McLaren. This was arguably one of, if not the worst weekend of the season for McLaren, on the basis of their car performance.
Yeah.
Cold climate, really cold conditions, even though the race, it was a few degrees warmer than had previously been the case on practice day and on qualifying day, and obviously the low grip conditions. The car just did not perform as or to the level that we've previously seen from McLaren. So they do now face a lot of pressure going into the Qatar Grand Prix next weekend, and more so, I think, than Ferrari, because Ferrari, as I say, is the team that has been coming on strong to a certain extent. They've eroded that lead. Yes, they didn't get the level of performance that they wanted out of this weekend, and McLaren, to a certain extent, can thank Mercedes for how well they performed, because what we thought, you and I, Nick, was going to be a Ferrari 1-2 coming out of qualifying, and both you and I pretty much predicted that.
Yeah.
You did especially, and I agreed with you, because we felt Ferrari's race pace was a cut above its rivals. That didn't materialise. So there's going to be a lot of head scratching going on, both inside Maranello and inside Woking, as to why the cars didn't perform as expected. And this is part of the reason that I talked about why 2025 is going to be, I think, so special next season. You know, when you've got two teams like that who've performed so well for many different reasons coming into this weekend, and then all of a sudden they come out of this weekend and the level of performance just wasn't there. But the belief is, given the nature of the circuit, and we are going to be expecting reasonably nice temperatures. We're going to be nowhere near the heat wave of Qatar last year. We're looking at, so far the forecast is showing around 24, 25 degrees, which is really nice, pleasant weather, good operating window for that McLaren. And as I said, the belief is that McLaren will have the upper hand going into that weekend. But nevertheless, they've still got probably a lot of work to do to ensure that they live up to that belief.
And of course, it was 6th and 7th for McLaren in Las Vegas, 3rd and 4th for Ferrari. And Sam, I'll come to you on this point, because Ferrari, whilst they did take a good chunk of points out of McLaren, yes, okay, Ferrari also didn't actually have the race pace they were expecting. They were the favourites for victory. And also, as you mentioned, we both predicted it'd be a 1-2. Ferrari also has potentially, I don't know if it's a problem to deal with, but Carlos Sainz and Charles Leclerc, obviously Carlos leaving the team for Williams at the end of the season, Lewis Hamilton coming in, and really, I don't know if feud's the right word either, but both drivers pretty animated, it's fair to say, after the race, particularly Leclerc, probably the most aggravated I think he's ever sounded over the radio, using the F word, well, several times. And This is kind of happening, though, it feels like, at the worst time for Ferrari when they need cool heads. And it does seem as well that once again, the strategy for Ferrari just went a little bit wrong, with Carlos being told not to overtake Leclerc, but then Carlos overtaking Leclerc, and the timing of the pit stops. At one point, Carlos was looking like he was going to come to the pits, and all of a sudden cut across the pit entry and rejoined onto the circuit, which wasn't penalised for some reason, was ultimately just given as exceeding track limits. But it feels like Ferrari, we've praised them actually for several times this season for their strategy, something they've been criticised for a lot over recent years. But it does feel like they got it a bit wrong in Las Vegas, and it's resulted in actually both their drivers being a bit annoyed with one another.
I think there's so many points to make here that I'm bound to forget at least one. But I think the timing's silly in terms of this kind of, and I wouldn't call it a feud. I wouldn't even call it infighting. I'd call it kind of like this kind of petty bickering between the two of them. And okay, petty's maybe unfair, because when you have a plan, or you're told something explicitly over team radio, as Charles was told, Carlos has been asked, or not even asked, Carlos has been told not to fight you. Charles coming out of the pits, obviously needs to get his tyres up to temperature. Carlos comes through, overtakes him within 3 corners. That then obviously Charles reacts to, probably doesn't get his tyres into the right window, and it has a knock-on effect, and you lose the pace, and you kind of it snowballs. So that was silly of the two of them. I think realistically they'll be okay, because they both have that greater goal in mind with these final two rounds. I think they will reassess this and go, right, okay, we really didn't handle that in the right way. Let's regroup. We've got a few days, and let's go into Qatar, which is a race weekend, and this is a saving grace for McLaren, where Ferrari aren't anticipating being as strong. So they've got work to do. Ferrari know they have work to do. Yes, they're on track to, if they, quite nicely, quite cutely, if they take 12 points in the next 2 rounds apiece, they'll end up level at the end of the season, and then it goes to countback. And I'm sure on countback it would it be McLaren? I don't actually know. It depends. It depends on how those points are divided, I guess.
I believe Ferrari have more wins.
We'll go on countback of wins. It will go on countback of wins. Yeah,
it will.
It's a good point. I've not looked at that actually to see where that stands.
So I shouldn't throw things in just off the top of my head, but so. Yeah, so it's quite interesting, and Ferrari will be going, well, as Ian rightly points out, over the last triple header, we can just kind of basically replicate that. We're all good. So I think that's the bigger take home for Ferrari. But also, it could have been so much worse for McLaren. At one point in the race, Ferrari was second and third, McLaren was sixth and ninth, and that would have seen the deficit reduced to 14 points. So it actually worked much better in Ferrari's favour. In McLaren's favour through the rest of the race, even though they had a poor overall weekend. But yeah, just very quickly again on the Sainz penalty that wasn't. This is one of those fascinating things where you have to argue that if you don't make the race director change at the point it does it, does that get looked at under Neil's visage? Like, does that get referred to the stewards to be investigated? 3 weeks ago. For me, it's a slam dunk. In the rules, you can't do that. It might not have been dangerous in that specific context, but it can be very dangerous to do that. So yeah, that's quite mystifying. So I think Ferrari got let off the hook a bit there. And yeah, I think Carlos, again, the way he conducts himself in going against the team, you expect it from a driver who's leaving. You can't hold it against him in the sense that we asked these drivers to be ruthless. The fact that all of them were so praising of Max, despite his use of the dark arts, is that they all know they'd do exactly the same thing if the championship was on the line. And so you can't really hold that against the drivers. But also, in the moment, you've got to look at what the knock-on effects could be. And what if they, for some reason, ended up hitting each other? It was just a needless risk given the Constructors' Championship.
And actually, Ian, as you mentioned, the team that McLaren can thank is Mercedes, because we had a good feeling they'd have a good one-lap pace. They were pretty confident going to qualifying, but not confident going to the race. Everyone thought it was going to be the Ferrari show. And Lewis Hamilton, of course, recovered from 10th to 2nd. He said that had he not made the mistakes in Q3, the victory would have been a breeze, was his word. And it's just, I think comical maybe is the wrong word, but it's almost slightly amusing that the W15 was so fast at times during the race. Mercedes were 2 seconds per lap faster than everybody else. And you had the likes of Ferrari, McLaren, Red Bull suffering from tyre graining, degradation on both the medium and the hard compound. Toto Wolff revealed after the race that, strangely, Mercedes had no graining. They had almost no degradation, which is why Lewis Hamilton was punching in fastest lap after fastest lap for several laps in the closing stages. And to put the cherry on top, Toto joked after the race, if only someone knew why the car worked. Yes, okay, the cold conditions, it is seemingly a big part for it, but it generally feels that nobody quite knows in Mercedes why the car was quite so good.
If they don't know, what do you expect from me?
Very good. Brilliant.
If I did know, I'd be a Mercedes engineer, wouldn't I?
But it's
rather than
bizarre.
sitting here on this podcast. But yeah, I know what you mean. But I mean, we've seen previously that when that car has been victorious, and Lewis's 2 wins were in Silverstone and Belgium, where the temperatures were slightly cooler. And, every single Grand Prix this weekend was running, this season was running temperatures of around 15 to 20 degrees. Then more than likely, Mercedes would be Constructors' champions and one of either George or Lewis would be Drivers' champion. But that's just not been the case, quite obviously. But there is something about that car that quite clearly works in this kind of temperatures. Qatar might even play to their strengths again, because it's not going to be the blisteringly hot that we had last year. Yeah, it's going to be nice and pleasant, as I say, about 24, 25 degrees. And George was saying post-race that going into this triple header, that of the 3 Grand Prix, he was expecting Qatar to be the one where he felt the car would work the best. So if he was thinking that one and rather than this one, even he doesn't know quite clearly why his car and that of Lewis works so well around Las Vegas in these cold temperatures, low grip conditions. Yet it did. So, as I say, I'm not quite sure what answer you expect from me, but if the Mercedes people don't know, then yeah, mystery. But that's why, again, it going into next season, it's circuit specific, condition specific. Which team will be able to get a handle on its car to ensure that its operating window is greater, that allows it to work better across a variety of different tracks and conditions. As I say, it's going to be 2025 is going to be truly fascinating.
Just to build on Ian's answer in terms of just how much this round is an outlier and how much we really don't understand where the race was won and lost. Andrea Stella, and Ian will test, I love listening to Andrea Stella explain things. In fact, to the point that I'll be transcribing audio from him, and I'll just forget, and I'll just start listening to him, and I'm meant to be writing. But he had a really good explanation for why he felt McLaren were weak here, and it is very much an outlier. And he kind of debunked this whole idea that it was all to do with the rear wing and the specialist setup and low downforce, low drag, and actually saying it was more specifically for for McLaren's, and probably this might explain why Mercedes were so strong as well. It was completely to do with how the car its relationship with the tyres, and therefore then the track, and that was basically, he felt, where was won and lost, and it wasn't actually about how strong your car is or its aerodynamic package was. It was just about that transference to the tarmac. So yeah, potentially Mercedes just has a car that when we can completely lean on the tyres, like Ferrari last year, in cold conditions, we just find a window that works, and that's why it only works in this very, very specific scenario, because we don't have many winter races on the calendar, as it were.
What's staggering is, as well, you look at Sao Paulo and coming out of that weekend, Lewis Hamilton was saying that the car was the worst he'd ever driven in F1. Coming out of Vegas, and he was saying it's the best he's felt the W15 all season. It's crazy. You mentioned Las Vegas being a bit of an outlier and just how much changed. One thing which didn't change, Sergio Perez. I mean, we've spoken about him so many times.
Yeah, let's not dwell on it too much.
But we've spoken about him so many times. Because of his performances, criticised him more than praised him this season, but that's simply because his performances just haven't been good enough. And again, Las Vegas, yes, okay, an outlier, a quirky circuit with very, very weird track and air conditions, but knocked out in Q1, recovered to P10, finished behind Yuki Tsunoda, who is continuing to do brilliant stuff for RB. And, we've had the discussions, Ian and Sam, about, what do Red Bull do? Do they keep him? Do they sack him despite the contract? But Danica Patrick, who obviously has some very interesting views, many of which, if you agree with them, fair play. But actually, one thing she did say, which I've got to say I actually agreed with, was that it's gotten to a point now, and I think the comment came after qualifying, where it's actually getting quite sad for Checo, where we know he's a brilliant racing driver. You look back at his time when he was at Racing Point and Force India, almost the king of the midfield. You think of the way he claimed his first ever F1 win. He's an exceptional talent, and quite clearly things have gone wrong in the last couple of years at Red Bull. Sam, it is sad, isn't it? Because it's quite clear Red Bull do need to politely get rid of him and bring in, whether it's Yuki, Liam Lawson, whether they go for somebody completely different. But it's actually gone to a point now where it is sad of what's happening to Checo.
I'm really glad that just in the end there, you kind of mentioned the last couple of years, because this is a point I was going to make when we inevitably got to Sergio, was that he finished second last year. Max, yes, could have won the Constructors' Championship alone. But it's very easy to forget that we were having the same conversations about Sergio halfway through 2023.
The mid-season clip.
To an amplified extent this season. And it just shows that it just isn't changing. Dominant car, not dominant car, contracts in your pocket or not. He isn't able to deliver what he needs to. And Helmut Marko is now saying that it's going to go down to the shareholders. And you're going to go, well, okay, that's kind of saying that money talks. Cash is king, as Lewis says. And you kind of think, are they really going to leave him in the car again? Like, surely not. Because I think you're right that it's difficult to watch at this stage, because it doesn't solely sit on his shoulders. It takes a team as behind a driver to get the most out of the package, the environment, and they have struck gold with how they can deliver that for Max, albeit with a car that isn't as strong as it was and potentially will be next year or could be. but it just hasn't worked for Sergio the last couple of years. And I think it's very easy to look back at the Mexican Minister of Defense drive and in Abu Dhabi and all those brilliant things he did for Max and the team in that first year, and how he really felt like a breath of fresh air as a non-academy driver coming in. This, again, mature, seasoned veteran who knew how to deliver in the role that he was given. But yeah, they have to make a change for me. I just don't see how they can remain competitive without making a change. I saw someone make a really good point online that this is probably the most outweighted, lopsided driver pairing that included the champion since I think it was Lewis in 2008 when Heikki Kovalainen finished 7th in the constructors. And that, I mean, that is a long time. I don't. There's not really much more I can say other than they need to make a change. Either Yuki or Liam would be perfectly fine at this stage. It's almost got to the point where the time for talk is over. Please choose one of them.
And the thing is as well, Ian, is that we've heard Checo say several times, Las Vegas wasn't the first time he used, so to speak, the excuse of there being fundamental issues with his car. And of course, we know that his role in the team was obviously considered right at the start of the summer break. And of course, it was very quick that Red Bull came out and said, no, we're sticking with him for the remainder of the season and looking to head to 2025. But you almost feel now that Red Bull should have perhaps actually, despite the money Checo brings in, which is, of course, a massive amount, we understand, you almost think that Red Bull should have just been brave. And despite the money he brings in, because ultimately they're not going to win no matter what Max does. They're probably not going to win the constructors' standings because Ferrari and McLaren, McLaren were disappointing in Vegas, but do consistently normally have two drivers performing. Red Bull need that now. Also looking ahead to 2025, they can't just rely on Max because so many teams are just so close.
Yeah, I don't want to touch on this one too much. Sam's pretty much covered everything, and we've obviously discussed it on many occasions. They just need to get another driver in. Just bite the bullet, put Checo out of his misery, regardless of the money. Yes, I know it's a lot of money and it means an awful lot to the team, and obviously cash is king, when you're running a highly expensive Formula One team. But as I touched on in one of the updates over the weekend, it's weighing up how much money they bring in from sponsorship compared to how much money they've lost in the finishing position in the championship. And probably the one does outweigh the other. They do get the money from Checo's array of sponsors, and it becomes tough, because obviously Yuki or Liam, he's not going to bring in the kind of sponsorship money that Checo's got behind him. It becomes a very tough decision for a team like Red Bull in particular. They're going to have one eye on 2026 as well. And the amount of money that's required, not just to build a brand new car, but they've also got a highly expensive power unit operation to run. And when, for the first time in their history, and when Checo brings in the amount of money that he does, rumored to be somewhere in the region of $30 million from his array of sponsors, that goes a hell of a long way to funding your power unit operation. It is a tough call as a team, though. When I put it like that, as we know as a driver, he's not good enough. Yeah. But they've got to think about the bigger picture, and that's the money that he brings in and what they've got to fund as a team going forward. And that power unit operation is one heck of a lot of money.
I mean, you've almost, I was going to say, Ian, you've almost convinced me that he should stay by that explanation, because you put it so brilliantly that it's just such a kind of between a rock and a hard place type decision.
Two very quick final talking points to get through. And as you're both absolutely right, Ian, in F1, cash is king, which is why there are so many eyes, not only on the top of the Constructors' Championship, but also for the battle for 6th between Haas, Alpine and RB. And of course, in Las Vegas, despite Pierre Gasly starting 3rd for Alpine. He had a really unfortunate retirement. Nico Hülkenberg finishing 8th means that going into Qatar, Haas are back in 6th, 1 point ahead of Alpine. I mean, we speak about the fight between Ferrari and McLaren going down to the wire. This one looks even closer, and we've seen that there's last lap overtakes so often in that midfield. The battle for 6th could quite literally go down to that last lap in Abu Dhabi. So I'm going to put both of you on the spot. Which team gets 6th?
That's
Go
a
on,
really
Sam,
tough
you go
question.
first then.
I mean, I didn't even think about the Gasly permutations when he retired. I was so just kind of it's disappointing, isn't it, when a driver is out of their station in a car.
I'm saying Haas.
I think Haas. I'm going Alpine.
There we go.
I'm saying Haas because they've got 2 drivers, whereas Alpine has only got 1. Esteban Ocon just does not have the car beneath him. He's unlike Pierre, who has performed brilliantly, especially over 1 lap in qualifying of late. Esteban has been bemoaning that car considerably over these past few Grand Prix. So pretty much you're going, and then when you look at RB, who are only 4 points behind Haas, 3 points behind Alpine, they've got 2 drivers in the fight, but I just think, for me, the experience of Nico and Kevin, and bearing in mind that they've just, for me, got the slightly better car right now, I do believe, I think just gives them the edge going into these last 2 Grand Prix. So that's why I'm going Haas.
I'm going Haas as well, and I just think it'd be such a plucky story. Probably the least funded team on the grid you'd imagine, and the fact they went under a big leadership change as well is worth remembering at the start of the season. I just think it'd be a brilliant story.
Alpine haven't multiple times over multiple years.
Fair point. All right, fair point. I'm going to rewind. Final talking
just
point.
Cut that little bit out.
Cut that bit out. Yeah, it's done. We'll leave it in the end of season highlights reel.
I never thought I'd feel so passionately about Alpine.
They've got enough money to get a Mercedes power unit for 2026. They're clearly doing all right. Right, final talking point. I'm glad you guys brought it up.
Money on a Renault engine program.
Well, fair point.
Maybe they should slide Sergio Perez.
Here we go. Coming to you shortly on Racing News 365. No. Right. GM, Cadillac, 2026. Weirdly, the big story that obviously was kind of breaking at the start of the Las Vegas Grand Prix was that F1 are set to approve GM as an 11th team on the grid for 2026. And Ian, I'll come to you on this one because obviously you were on the ground in Vegas, still are on the ground in Las Vegas, but obviously...
I might be here for a while. I'm going to give my flight.
Initially, of course, though, it was all about Andretti being partnered by GM, whereas now it feels that the dynamic has changed quite considerably in that it seems now actually it's GM rather than Andretti, it seems, that are going to get approved.
Yeah, and it's quite a talking point, this one, isn't it? Because we've seen the recent takeover at Andretti, and the belief is that Michael Andretti taking this big step backwards has really paved the way now for this to happen. For me, one of the biggest things that came out of the weekend were Toto Wolff's comments in the team principals press conference in between the 2 practice sessions on Thursday. And I've never heard it put like that. Toto basically turned around and said that Michael had never, ever spoken to him. He'd never once been approached. He'd never had a conversation. And he said, if I'm going to try and convince someone of who I am and what I've got, I'm going to go and speak to all those people and say, here I am. This is what I'm bringing to the party. This is what I can do for F1. And Toto seems, from what he was saying, I got the impression that he felt Michael went about things quite the wrong way. And if you think of some of the things that Michael came out with in the media after the FIA had approved the bid before it went to F1, and whilst it was all that length of time being weighed up by F1, he really kind of shot himself in the foot to a certain extent. And I think he rubbed a lot of people up the wrong way. So him now, as I say, removing himself pretty much out of the picture this has now paved the way for this bid to go forward. The obvious thing is, of course, that yes, whilst GM will be coming in as the OEM, and obviously for F1, that's what they've long been talking about, is having these OEMs within the sport. Behind the scenes, of course, it's the Andretti operation that is going to be building and running this car. So it's quite an interesting dynamic what's gone on here. But at least the bottom line is, after all this furore over this near enough 2 years coming up now, we are finally going to get an 11th team on the grid in 2026. And I think that is absolutely fantastic for the sport.
I completely agree. And what's interesting is that Andretti are actually putting a lot of job applications currently on LinkedIn. So if there's anybody wanting a job in Formula One, Andretti are hiring probably for 2026. Ian, I'll come back to you just finally because it's the end of the podcast. We have got our bold predictions left, but what is this trivia then? Come on. Is it that Fangio is the only non-European to have won 4 or more?
No, again, there's a more distinct...
True as that may be.
There is a more distinct...
Okay, what is it then? Come on, before we do our predictions, because this is annoying me.
Sam? Do you know it?
Yeah.
Go on then, you give the answer. I'll allow you to...
I hope he's wrong.
Oh, that would be so funny. It would be. It's that Alain Prost is the only 4-time world champion not to win his, or at least 4 consecutively. He won in 85 and 86, and then in 89 and 93.
Yeah.
So
interesting.
That's the and my
the 5 all won 4 consecutive.
Yeah, all consecutive.
Yeah. So Fangio was 53 to 57. Schumacher was 2000 to 2004, which is 5.
Yeah.
5.
Which Max could equal next year.
Could do.
Seb was obviously
2010 to
2013. Yeah. And then Lewis was 2017 to 2020.
2020.
So I mean, yeah. So, but my
well
fun
done,
fact,
folks, if you got that right.
Well done.
Yes, very good. But my fun fact, and I mentioned this to Ian this morning, is, and I don't know why I mentioned it. I can't remember. It was a long time ago. That in '88, and yes, this isn't how the championship was decided at the time. Prost outscored Senna over the 16 rounds, but at the time, because you only took the 11 best results, Senna had a better aggregate score over those 11 rounds. So that 88 title went to Senna. So Prost would have been a 5-time world champion. And then it's a lot of what if and aboutisms, but I think it's quite an interesting fact that I think some people might not be aware of.
We will not be running that poll on Racing News 365 whether that should be reintroduced, because I think that's a worse idea than the double points season finale. This might be the longest podcast we've ever done, so rapid bold predictions, and I'll kick things off with a very, very bold one. McLaren are going to win the constructors title in Qatar. Sam?
In Qatar. Okay.
Bold prediction. I'm going to go right against you. Ferrari going to take the lead of the Constructors' Championship in Qatar.
Ian.
I'm going really bold.
We're going really bold. End of season.
Go for broke. What, the Red Bull are going to come on strong and win the Constructors' title?
Perez victory.
Sergio Perez is going to U-turn.
Sergio Perez is going to save his seat with a victory in the last 2 Grand Prix. I think we're going to see Mercedes again strong in Qatar. George said it, and I'm going to go with George. But hey, we don't know why that Mercedes works and doesn't work, so it's probably going to be completely wrong.
We'll put you down for a 1-2 Mercedes finish.
Very interesting. I like it. And of course, for those who are watching this podcast on YouTube, let us know your bold predictions in the comment section below, and just let us know your thoughts on any of the talking points we've discussed, or just any of your thoughts from the Las Vegas Grand Prix. This has been the latest episode of the Racing News 365 podcast, a very long one, may I add, from Ian, Sam, and myself. We will see you this weekend for the Qatar Grand Prix. See you later.
Hopefully I do leave Las Vegas. Take care, folks.
Thanks for joining us.